Buried inside a forgotten station at the edge of the galaxy, there was a file someone didn't want found. It had a name instead of a code, and 4 words written by a human hand. "Do not open this." That was how it started. Station K-17 drifted quietly in the outer halo of the Carthus system, a lonely metal structure hanging in the darkness far beyond the last inhabited world. Its exterior lights had dimmed long ago from bright navigation beacons into a faint amber glow that flickered slowly, like an old machine breathing in its sleep. Inside, the corridors were narrow and still. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that came from machinery that had been running for so long it had forgotten what silence used to feel like. Every few minutes, somewhere deep in the station structure, a cooling pipe clicked softly as it contracted. A distant processor hummed with patient determination. The station's aging air recyclers exhaled with a soft sigh every 30 seconds, moving thin currents of recycled oxygen through the empty halls. For most people, the place would have felt unsettling. For Arlen Voss, it felt like home. Arlen worked for the Interstellar Cartography Authority, though the job title made his assignment sound much more important than it actually was. In reality, he had been sent to K-17 for a task that no senior cartographer wanted anywhere near their record: archive maintenance. Thousands of years of survey data had accumulated in forgotten storage arrays scattered across the outer systems, and someone had decided that the records needed to be cleaned, organized, and transferred to the central database. Arlen had drawn the short straw. 3 months alone in an obsolete listening station copying ancient star charts. Most interns complained about assignments like this. Arlen didn't. He sat in the station's primary archive room, leaning back in a chair that had been designed for a species slightly taller than humans. The seat creaked quietly as he shifted his weight, the sound echoing faintly through the circular chamber. In front of him floated a pale blue holographic interface filled with folders, catalog numbers, and survey logs dating back hundreds of years. His fingers moved lazily through the files. Most of the data was routine: asteroid belt measurements, navigation corrections, outdated gravitational readings. Every few minutes, he copied a block of files into the transfer queue, where the station's slow uplink beam would send them toward the central database in the core systems. The process took time, a lot of time, which left Arlen with plenty of opportunity to do what he genuinely enjoyed: looking for mistakes. Not errors exactly, more like things that didn't quite belong. He had always liked old things. Old ships, old systems, old records. There was something about the way old places accumulated small accidents and quiet contradictions that newer stations never had. Somewhere in the accumulation of centuries, interesting things had a way of getting left behind. Overlooked, buried under layers of the routine and the expected. Old places had a habit of hiding interesting mistakes. After 2 weeks aboard K-17, he had already found several. A mislabeled pulsar survey from 3 centuries ago, filed under entirely the wrong star system. An entire navigation report that somehow described stellar coordinates 100 light-years away from where it claimed to be. One particularly strange atmospheric scan that appeared to describe a planet that no longer existed anywhere in the current galactic registry. He had flagged them all for review. It made the work slightly less boring. The archive lights flickered briefly above him. Arlen glanced upward. The station did that sometimes. Nothing serious. Just aging power relays shifting loads through circuits that had been running continuously for over 2 centuries without meaningful maintenance. He returned his attention to the floating directory. Thousands of files scrolled slowly past his eyes. Survey cluster. Trade route calibration. Deep space gravitational drift logs. Routine. 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 And then something appeared that wasn't routine at all. Arlen's hand stopped moving. The file sat quietly between 2 automated catalog entries like a word misspelled in an otherwise perfect sentence. Every other file name in the directory followed the authority's standard format without exception. System code. Date. Survey classification. Long strings of numbers and letters that told a reader exactly what was inside before they ever opened anything. But this one didn't. This one had a name. Not a code. A name. Arlen leaned forward slowly, squinting at the display. The text glowed softly in the holographic interface. Primary survey record. Below it, in smaller letters, there was a warning. Archive status, restricted. Arlen frowned slightly. That alone was strange enough. But it was the second line that made him stop breathing for a moment. Because the file carried a note that looked very different from the station's usual automated warnings. It wasn't written in machine formatting. It looked like it had been typed by an actual person. The message was short. Very short. Just 4 words. Do not open this. Arlen stared at the warning for a long moment. The words hung in the air above the console, quiet and stubborn. Do not open this. That wasn't how archive warnings were supposed to look. Official files used automated security tags, clean, standardized notices generated by the cartography authority systems. Things like restricted access or clearance required or authorized personnel only. They were cold and formal and entirely impersonal. This wasn't. This sounded like someone had left a message behind. Someone who had wanted to be very clear. Arlen leaned closer to the display. The archive room hummed softly around him, the old processors whispering through cooling vents in the walls. The flickering ceiling lights cast pale reflections across the curved metal surfaces of the chamber. Outside the station's observation window, the Karthus system drifted slowly past. A quiet sea of stars. Arlen tapped the file. Nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. Locked, he muttered. That wasn't unusual on its own. Old archives often carried access restrictions. But those restrictions were normally tied to clearance codes or standard administrative locks that the system could at least explain. The strange part was that this file wasn't even properly listed in the station's directory index. It existed inside the folder structure, visible if you knew where to look, but the system treated it like it wasn't really there. Like a room in a building that had been walled over and left off every floor plan. Almost like it had been hidden. Arlen opened the metadata panel. The information that appeared made his eyebrows rise slowly. File size, 8.2 petabytes. He let out a quiet whistle. That wasn't a survey file. That was an entire data library. Most stellar surveys were a few terabytes at most. Detailed scans of planetary systems, gravitational models, atmospheric readings, navigation data, all compressed into manageable packages built for transmission across interstellar distances. This file was thousands of times larger than that, which meant one of two things. Either someone had made a very serious filing mistake, or this wasn't a survey file at all. Arlen glanced again at the warning. Do not open this. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. For a long moment, he considered the responsible option. Flag the file. Send a report to the authority. Let someone with higher clearance handle it properly. That would be the correct thing to do. It would also mean waiting several weeks for a response from the core systems, followed by another month while some distant committee decided whether the file was important enough to warrant examination, followed by another delay while the appropriate clearance was arranged, followed by nothing actually happening for at least another 6 months. Arlen looked back at the glowing words. The problem with warnings like that was simple. They triggered curiosity. And curiosity was something Arlen had never been very good at ignoring. It was the same impulse that had made him flag the mislabeled pulsar survey. The same impulse that made him spend hours cross-referencing old navigation charts just to find where a single coordinate had been transposed by 2 decimal places 300 years ago. He leaned forward again. Just a look, he said quietly to the empty room. His fingers moved across the console. The station's archive interface opened the security panel, displaying the file's access controls. The permissions were strange. There was no encryption key, no clearance lock, just a simple administrative restriction that prevented the file from being opened through normal access commands. The kind of lock that assumed nobody would ever think to go looking for the file directly. The kind of lock that worked by being invisible rather than impenetrable, which meant whoever had hidden it hadn't expected anyone to search for it directly. Arlen smiled faintly. That kind of restriction was easy to bypass. He opened the station's maintenance console and issued a manual file call, routing around the standard access layer entirely. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ancient processors deep inside the station began to wake up. Fans spun faster. Cooling systems adjusted their draw. Somewhere in the station structure, far below the archive room, an old server rack clicked to life after what might have been decades of uninterrupted sleep. A deep mechanical vibration moved briefly through the floor. The archive display flickered. A loading bar appeared. Arlen leaned forward. The progress bar crept forward slowly. Very slowly. Whatever was inside the file, it was enormous. The station system strained quietly around him, redistributing power to storage access systems that clearly hadn't been asked to work this hard in a very long time. Minutes passed. The station hummed steadily around him, as though it were slowly remembering how to perform tasks it had long ago stopped expecting to need. Arlen waited. At the 4-minute mark, the loading bar reached completion. The screen went dark for a moment. Then the display changed. Arlen blinked. The interface that appeared looked nothing like the Cartography Authority's modern survey software. It was older, much older. The design was minimal, almost primitive compared to modern navigation systems. The fonts were different. The layout was different. Even the color palette belonged to a generation of software that hadn't been in standard use for centuries. At the center of the display floated a three-dimensional star map. A large one. Arlen felt a small jolt of recognition move through him. He knew this region. This was the outer western spiral arm of the galaxy. Cartography students memorized the layout during training. The broad sweep of stellar formations. The major navigation clusters. The established lanes that connected the inhabited worlds of the conclave to the quieter outer territories. But something about the map felt wrong. Arlen leaned closer. The stars were arranged in detailed clusters, glowing softly across the holographic projection. Each system carried labels, population estimates, planetary surveys, trade potential, atmospheric compositions, infrastructure assessments. It was an extremely detailed map. Too detailed. Because according to the Cartography Authority's official records, most of this region wasn't mapped at all. Arlen opened the comparison overlay. The station pulled up the current galactic charts alongside the ancient file. Two maps appeared side by side, and suddenly the problem became completely obvious. The official charts showed a massive gray region in this section of the spiral arm, a vast, featureless patch stretching across nearly 400 star systems. The label printed across it was simple and official. Uncharted space. Arlen had seen it countless times during training. Cartographers were taught that the region had never been fully explored due to navigational hazards and unstable gravitational currents. Survey missions had supposedly been postponed for centuries. It was just one of those blank areas that still existed at the edges of the known galaxy, a reminder that even after thousands of years of exploration, there were places that remained untouched. Except now he was looking at a version of the chart where the region wasn't blank at all. The old survey map showed stars everywhere. Hundreds of them. Arlen zoomed in slowly. The projection expanded outward, revealing detailed markers across hundreds of systems. Each star had a designation. Planetary information scrolled beside every one. Atmospheric compositions, population estimates, industrial activity, trade route connections, navigation hazard ratings, infrastructure surveys. This wasn't a partial survey. This was the kind of mapping effort that took generations. The kind of comprehensive documentation that only happened when a civilization had been carefully studied over a very long period of time. 412, Arlen murmured. The number appeared automatically in the system index. Total systems, 412. 412 star systems. Most of them with inhabited planets. Navigation lanes connecting them in dense, well-traveled patterns. Arlen leaned closer to the projection, slowly rotating the star field with his hand. He recognized several stellar formations immediately. The Orion Drift Cluster, the Helios Corridor. All of them are sitting exactly where they should be. Exactly where any student of galactic cartography would expect to find them. Except on the official map, those areas were empty. Gray. Uncharted. Arlen pulled up the metadata attached to the ancient file. The timestamps made his stomach tighten. Primary survey initiated 1,087 years ago. Final update 802 years ago. The file hadn't been modified since then, which meant the map he was looking at was 8 centuries old. And for 8 centuries, every single system it described had simply not existed on any publicly available chart. He switched back to the modern chart again. The gray region still stared back at him. Empty. Erased. Patient. Arlen rubbed the back of his neck slowly. There was only one explanation that made any sense. Someone had removed these systems from the official records. Not accidentally. Not through negligence or filing errors or the slow decay of data across centuries. Deliberately. He opened the archive search interface. If this map was real, there had to be other records connected to it somewhere. Survey reports, colonization data, trade logs, Diplomatic correspondence. Something. Arlen typed the first search query. Human space. The archive returned 0 results. He frowned and tried a different approach. Sol system. 0 results. He sat back slightly, because every educated person in the galaxy knew what Sol was. Earth, the human homeworld, the origin point of one of the most widespread species in interstellar civilization. Humans operated shipping companies, research fleets, mining operations, even several diplomatic outposts across the core systems. They were everywhere, on every station, in every port, working on every kind of vessel from cargo haulers to deep exploration craft. So why was their home territory missing from the database entirely? Arlen narrowed his search further. He removed the word human and searched for the system designation instead. Sol 3. The archive paused for a longer moment than usual, then returned a message he had never seen before in 2 years of working with Cartography Authority databases. Archive access restricted. Arlen sat very still. That was different from a missing file. A missing file meant the record had been deleted or lost. A restricted record meant the information existed. It was here, somewhere in K-17's ancient storage arrays. But it had been locked, deliberately sealed away from standard access. The quiet suddenly felt heavier. He turned back toward the star map. 412 systems. All of them were removed from public charts 800 years ago. He opened the historical navigation database and began pulling old route records from the station's deep archive storage. For a moment, nothing happened. Then several ancient shipping routes appeared on the display. Arlen studied them carefully, and something strange jumped out immediately. The older routes passed directly through the gray region. Freighters, survey vessels, diplomatic couriers, passenger liners, all of them traveling through space that the modern charts insisted had never been explored. But around 8 centuries ago, the routes changed. Arlen watched the timeline advance slowly across the display. Trade lanes gradually bent away from the region. Survey missions stopped appearing in the logs. Navigation corridors shifted outward like water, slowly moving around an obstacle. The entire galactic transportation network had quietly, methodically rerouted itself, avoiding those stars, avoiding human space. That wasn't a random change driven by new hazard assessments or shifting trade economics. That was coordinated, quiet, careful, and extremely deliberate. Someone had reached across the entire infrastructure of galactic navigation and nudged every major route away from 412 stars without anyone appearing to notice or object. He opened another file cluster. Diplomatic records. Most of them were routine. Treaties, trade negotiations, migration agreements, boundary disputes between species with overlapping territorial claims. Then he found something odd. An index reference pointing to a file that no longer existed. The description was brief. Conclave Directive 1 Prime. Arlen clicked the reference. The archive searched for several seconds before returning a result. The document itself had been deleted, but the system still contained a fragment of the original record. Just the header. Just enough to read. The text appeared slowly across the screen. Directive 1 Prime. All survey activity within the designated Western Arm exclusion zone is hereby suspended indefinitely. All cartographic records referencing the region will be reclassified at the highest restriction level. Public star charts will reflect the region as uncharted space until further notice. Arlen read the words twice. No explanation followed. No justification. No statement of reasoning or cause or concern. Just signatures. 17 of them. Members of the High Council. 8 centuries ago. 17 signatures. No explanation. No justification. As if the reason was so obvious to everyone present in that chamber that committing it to writing seemed unnecessary. As if the decision had been made quietly and everyone involved had agreed, without debate, that the less was recorded the better. He leaned back slowly in the chair. Outside the observation window, the stars of the Carthus system burned silently against the black. Inside the archive room, the ancient processors hummed steadily. Arlen looked back at the map. 412 star systems. An entire civilization removed from the galactic record. Not destroyed. Not lost. Not abandoned by their own choice. Hidden. And the people who had hidden them had not seen fit to write down why. He exhaled quietly. Why? He whispered to the empty room. The star map rotated slowly in the air before him, each glowing system marking a place where people lived. where ships traveled, where history had continued for centuries without appearing on any official record anywhere in the known galaxy. Arlen did not sleep that night. He told himself several times that he should. The station's internal clock had already passed the local midnight cycle, and the work schedule he had been given by the Cartography Authority recommended regular rest periods to maintain cognitive accuracy during archive processing. But the idea of leaving the console felt impossible, because every time he looked at the map, the same thought returned. 412 star systems. Hidden. Not destroyed. Not lost. Just removed. And somewhere in the station's ancient databanks, there had to be more. Someone had ordered the erasure. Someone had written the directive. Someone had known why. And somewhere, buried under centuries of carefully maintained silence, some fragment of that story had to have survived. Arlen leaned forward again and opened the deep archive index. K-17 was old enough that most of its storage arrays predated the modern galactic network. That meant many of its records existed only locally, preserved on physical server stacks that had been quietly accumulating data for centuries without any of it being flagged for transfer or review or deletion. If anything survived the purge, it would be here. He started searching. The first few hours produced almost nothing. Official records had been scrubbed with incredible precision. Survey logs referencing the Western Arm simply ended 800 years ago, mid-project in several cases, as if the missions had been discontinued overnight. Trade reports stopped mentioning the region without explanation. Even diplomatic correspondence avoided any reference to the area, as if an entire section of the galaxy had agreed simultaneously to stop discussing a topic that everyone already knew about. It was like reading a history book where someone had carefully cut out every chapter about a particular country. Not destroy them entirely, just remove them. Left the rest of the book intact. Let the gaps speak for themselves. But gaps were also clues. Arlen changed tactics. Instead of searching for the missing records directly, he started searching for references to things that no longer existed. Indirect mentions. Background details and documents that were primarily about something else entirely. The results appeared slowly. A navigation bulletin referencing a route correction near a star that no longer appeared on modern charts. A cargo log describing a shipment bound for a colony world whose coordinates now fell inside the gray patch. A maintenance request for a relay station positioned in space the official charts insisted was empty. Small fragments. Isolated details. Pieces of a puzzle someone had tried very hard to scatter across a century of otherwise ordinary records. Most of them didn't say much, but one entry caught his attention and held it. It was buried at the end of a diplomatic archive folder, attached to a message that otherwise discussed trade tariffs between two minor species with no obvious connection to anything Arlen had been looking for. At the bottom of the document, almost like a footnote, there was a personal note. The author's name had been removed, but the message remained. Arlen enlarged the text. I strongly recommend that the Council reconsider the proposal to pressure the humans economically. We do not understand the long-term consequences of such an action. Some borders exist not because they are defended, but because everyone involved understands they should remain where they are. Human space appears to be one of those borders. Arlen read the note again. The date attached to the document placed it roughly 3 centuries after Directive 1 Prime had been issued, which meant that even then, centuries after the erasure, the secrecy had still been fully intact, and someone in the Council had still been actively considering using economic pressure against humanity. He opened another search window. Economic conflict, Western Arm. The archive produced several references. Most of them were incomplete. Entire sections of documents had been removed with the same surgical precision as the survey logs. But one entry survived in a particularly unusual place. It appeared in the personal log of a freight captain whose ship had briefly passed near the border region 800 years ago, preserved only because the log file had been misfiled inside an unrelated maintenance record. The file opened with a soft chime. The entry was short. Day 112. Trade routes have shifted again. The Solon Merchant Collective is rerouting all traffic away from the Western Arm. No official announcement, but everyone in the shipping lanes knows what's happening. They think cutting the humans off will make them desperate. Personally, I think that's a mistake. Humans don't get desperate. They get busy. Arlen frowned slightly. He continued reading. Day 181. The embargo failed. 6 months. That's all it took. Humans built their own trade network across their systems. Then they started offering better prices to half the independent worlds in the sector. The Solon Collective ended the blockade quietly and without explanation. Nobody talks about it anymore. So that explained one piece of it. Someone had tried to isolate humanity economically, and humanity had responded by building something better than what had been taken away. But a failed trade dispute wasn't enough to justify erasing an entire civilization from the star charts. He kept searching. Military records took longer to surface. The station's archive processors labored through increasingly ancient storage layers before eventually returning several references. Most had been heavily redacted, entire paragraphs replaced with blank space. But one document remained fully intact. Not an official report. A journal entry. The author was listed simply as Surveyor Seltavar. The date placed it around the same period as the directive. Arlen opened it. Observation log, outer western arm. We passed near the human border today. Protocol required that we maintain distance, so we did not cross. But from the observation deck, I could see their ships. 2 of them. Large vessels, heavily armored, nothing like the designs in our catalog. They remained completely still the entire time we were in the sector, just watching. I asked the captain if we should report the sighting. She told me to set a new course and forget we had seen anything. Apparently, everyone already knows. Arlen leaned closer. The entry continued. The strange thing is not that they were there. The strange thing is that they did nothing. They didn't approach. They didn't signal. They didn't warn us away. They simply waited. It was the most uncomfortable silence I have ever experienced in space. Not because it felt threatening, because it felt patient. Arlen sat quietly for a moment after finishing the entry. The station's air recyclers sighed softly behind him. Silence. Waiting ships. Borders nobody crossed. A pattern was becoming clearer, but the biggest piece still felt missing. Because none of these fragments explained why the directive had been created in the first place. What had happened that was significant enough to make 17 members of the High Council sign their names to an order that removed an entire civilization from the maps? He tried a different search. First contact, Sol System. The archive paused. Several files appeared. Most of them were deleted. But one small record survived intact. A survey summary. A report written by the very first exploration team that had visited Earth. Arlen opened it slowly. The document began with routine information. A yellow star. A habitable planet orbiting in the 3rd position. A developing species that had recently begun producing electromagnetic signals detectable at interstellar distances. That wasn't unusual. During the early era of conclave expansion, first contacts had been happening regularly across the spiral arms. New civilizations were being discovered every few decades. But as he continued reading, the tone of the report shifted. The expedition's biology specialist had written the first observation that caught his eye. Initial observations of the species calling itself humanity indicate a highly adaptable bipedal organism with unusual physiological resilience. Human metabolic tolerance is significantly broader than most conclave species. Their bodies function in temperature ranges that would incapacitate many known intelligent life forms. They demonstrate rapid clotting, strong immune response, and high tolerance to injury. In controlled conditions, a human can remain conscious after injuries that would be fatal to the majority of known species. The species also demonstrates unusually high endurance levels. Humans regularly engage in extended physical exertion without apparent survival necessity. They refer to this activity as running. Arlen smiled faintly at that last detail. Then the cultural analysis section appeared, and the tone changed entirely. Human civilization has developed rapidly within the past few thousand years. Technological development is uneven but accelerating at a rate that exceeds most species at a comparable stage. Social structures are complex and frequently reorganized. He kept reading. However, it must be noted that humanity has been in a state of nearly continuous conflict throughout its recorded history. The species engages in wars not only between rival nations, but occasionally on a planetary scale. Several of these conflicts have involved weapons capable of ending all life on their world. Most concerning is the observation that humans have repeatedly chosen not to use their most destructive weapons despite possessing the capability to do so. This indicates that the species has developed restraint mechanisms alongside its violent tendencies. Such psychological contradictions are rare among known civilizations and extremely difficult to model with any reliability. Arlen rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Violent, resilient, complicated. A species that had built weapons capable of ending their own world and then chosen, repeatedly, not to use them. A species that ran for reasons that had nothing to do with survival. None of that explained the directive on its own, but it was beginning to paint a picture. He scrolled forward to the next attached document. The Breath Dominion had been the dominant military power in the known galaxy 800 years ago. Their fleets were massive. Their weapons were unmatched. Their expansion policy was uncomplicated. If a region of space was unclaimed or insufficiently defended, the Breath claimed it. Their entire history was a record of that policy applied across hundreds of star systems without meaningful resistance. Eventually, their scouts had reached the outer edge of human space. Fleet strength, 4,000 warships. Arlen let out a quiet breath. That was not a border patrol. That was an invasion force assembled with the specific intention of ending a conflict before it had properly begun. The records described the opening of the campaign in precise tactical language. Human defenses were minimal compared to the assembled Breath fleet. Their ships were fewer in number. Their technology is slightly behind. Every military projection generated by the Breath command structure predicted the same outcome. Human defeat within days. Then the battle reports began changing tone. Arlen read each entry slowly, watching the voice of the Breath admiral transform across the log. Day 3 of engagement. Human vessels refused to disengage despite sustaining severe damage. Several ships have continued operating after losing primary propulsion systems. One vessel rammed a Breath cruiser after exhausting all munitions. Day 9. Human forces are adapting tactics with unusual speed. They abandon positions that appear strategically valuable, only to attack from unexpected vectors later. Our predictive models are becoming unreliable. The early precision of a commander expecting a quick, clean victory was slowly giving way to something else. Something that read less like military confidence and more like the beginning of a very specific kind of dread. The particular unease of a soldier who has begun to realize that the enemy is not fighting the way enemies are supposed to fight. Day 21. Human ships are remaining in combat long after sustaining damage that should render them ineffective. Our forces are encountering persistent resistance across multiple systems simultaneously. The enemy appears entirely unwilling to acknowledge defeat. Then the final entry. Day 96. We are withdrawing. The humans continue to fight despite overwhelming losses on every front. I have observed a damaged human vessel remain operational for 6 hours after losing its primary hull integrity. It continued firing until it finally disintegrated. I cannot explain what drives them. I have commanded fleets for 30 years. I have never encountered an enemy that behaves this way. This is not how war is supposed to function. The next document was a scanned image. A physical note, recovered by the retreating Breath fleet after the battle ended. Written by hand. In careful, precise lettering. The translation appeared beneath it. We have returned your prisoners. Please do not attempt this again. Earth Defense Command. Arlen set his stylus down. He read the note again. 4,000 warships. 96 days. And humanity's entire response to the most powerful military force in the known galaxy was 9 words written on a piece of paper. Not a threat. Not a declaration of expanded conflict. Not a demand for reparations or territory or acknowledgement. Just a quiet, patient, almost polite suggestion. Please do not attempt this again. He sat with those words for a long time. The station hummed gently around him. Outside the window, the stars burned in their cold silence. There was something about the note that felt less like the declaration of a victor and more like the response of someone who had been mildly inconvenienced. Patient, certain, entirely unbothered by the scale of what had just happened. As if 4,000 warships had been roughly equivalent to a knock on the door that nobody had been in the mood to answer. Arlen exhaled slowly and moved on. The second story was different in almost every way. The Solemn Merchant Collective were not warriors. They had no interest in territorial expansion or military prestige. Their power came from something far more durable than the armed forces. They controlled trade routes across entire sectors of the galaxy, and the species that controlled trade routes controlled everything that moved along them. Resources, technology, information. The slow economic pressure of having access gradually restricted until cooperation became easier than resistance. Several centuries after the Breath conflict, the Solon had identified human space as a region worth bringing into their network. On their terms, instead of attacking, they tried to isolate. Trade lanes near the western arm were quietly rerouted through alternative corridors. Shipping contracts with human systems were allowed to expire without renewal. Merchants operating along the border were advised in careful, indirect language that commerce with the region would become progressively unprofitable. The goal was simple: cut human space off from galactic trade. Create dependency. Force negotiation. Month 1. Human exports declined as expected. Month 2. Human systems began establishing new internal shipping routes between their own colonies. Month 3. Human engineers rapidly expanded FTL transit lanes connecting systems that had previously relied on external carriers. Month 4. Human merchants began appearing in nearby independent systems, offering goods at prices the Solon network could not easily match because the Solon network's overhead had just gotten considerably larger. Month 6. The embargo ended. Without announcement, without explanation, without any public acknowledgement that it had ever existed. The final trade analysis report from the Solon Economic Advisory Board included one brief, plainly written comment. Human economic behavior is extremely difficult to suppress. Attempts to isolate them consistently result in rapid internal development that more than compensates for the imposed restriction. The embargo appears to have strengthened their economy rather than weakening it. Arlen leaned back again. The military invasion had failed. Economic isolation had failed. He continued searching. 2 smaller incidents surfaced in the archive fragments that followed, and both of them were strange in an entirely different way from the others. A deep survey drone operated by the Conclave Science Directorate had drifted off course near the border region and crossed accidentally into human territory. Standard procedure in such cases was to declare the unit lost, file an equipment replacement request, and move on. The drone had been declared lost accordingly. 3 months later, it returned to the last station that had tracked it. Not damaged, not adrift, repaired. The attached maintenance report listed several improvements made to the drone's navigation systems. Precision upgrades that the Conclave's own engineers had not yet developed. The report noted quietly that the modifications were subsequently copied into the standard design for the next generation of survey drones. But the most interesting detail wasn't the repairs. It was the small container that had been attached to the drone's exterior hull. Inside were small baked objects. Food. There was a handwritten note folded beneath them. Found your drone drifting. Fixed some things. Thought you might be hungry. Arlen laughed quietly. A short, genuine sound that disappeared immediately into the silence of the archive room. The final incident was different again. A passenger liner operating a standard route along the outer Conclave territories had suffered a cascading engine failure near the border and drifted into human space before the crew could correct course. They had sent out a standard distress signal with no particular expectation that anyone nearby would receive it. Human ships had arrived within hours. They had restored primary power to the liner, provided medical assistance to several passengers who had been injured during the initial failure, refueled the vessel from their own reserves, and then escorted it carefully back through the border corridor toward Conclave territory. They had not charged for any of the assistance provided. They had not requested anything in return, no diplomatic acknowledgement, no trade concession, no territorial consideration. They had asked only one question before departing. Were any humans on board who needed to return home? Arlen sat silently for a long time after reading that. He looked back at the star map. 412 stars glowing softly in the projection. He thought about the Breath Admiral sitting in his command chair on day 96, trying to understand why the ships on the other side of the engagement were still firing. He thought about the Solon economists watching 6 months of carefully constructed pressure produce the opposite of the intended result. He thought about a repair crew attaching baked goods to a survey drone and sending it home. None of these stories described a dangerous civilization. They described a persistent one. He pulled up a diplomatic transcript from just before the directive had been issued. Most of it was gone, but a few lines survived in the fragments the station had preserved. We are asking the wrong question about humanity. The concern is not what they might do to us. The concern is what they will continue doing no matter what we do to them. Arlen sat with that for a moment. Then he opened one last document. A historian writing centuries after the directive, working from incomplete records, trying to reconstruct what had happened with the Western Arm exclusion zone. Human behavior appears to follow a consistent pattern across every documented interaction. When faced with a problem, humans attempt to solve it. If the first solution fails, they attempt another, and another, and another. There is no clear threshold at which the cost of continued effort causes the species to abandon a goal entirely. Most species we have studied will eventually stop when a situation becomes effectively impossible. Humans do not appear to share this instinct. Humans abandon goals only when the goal stops being interesting. Arlen leaned back in his chair and read that last line again. Humans abandon goals only when the goal stops being interesting. He looked at the star map. He thought about the Breath Admiral's log. I do not understand what keeps them fighting. He thought about the Solon trade report. The embargo strengthened their economy. He thought about the drone note. Found your drone drifting. Fix some things. And suddenly the pattern locked into place with a clarity that felt almost physical. The galaxy wasn't afraid of humanity's technology. It wasn't their military capability or their population or any particular weapon system the first contact teams had cataloged. It was something much simpler than any of those things. Humans didn't stop. If attacked, they kept fighting. If isolated, they built something new. If something broke, they fixed it. If someone told them something was impossible, that was typically the moment humans became most interested in finding out whether that was actually true. The directive made sudden, complete sense. Survey activity suspended indefinitely. That wasn't a quarantine. It wasn't a containment of a threat that needed to be managed at a safe distance. It was something far simpler. It was avoidance. A quiet agreement among 17 members of the High Council that the easiest way to deal with a species that refused to stop, under any circumstances, for any reason, was to stop acknowledging that they were there. To pretend the 412 stars didn't exist, and hope that the civilizations occupying them would simply continue doing whatever they were doing without requiring anyone else to figure out what to do about them. Arlen shook his head slowly. 800 years of carefully maintained silence. 800 years of rerouted trade lanes and redacted survey logs and blank space on every public chart in the known galaxy. 17 signatures and no explanation, because the explanation was too strange to commit to writing. We don't know how to deal with them, so we'll pretend they aren't there. And somehow humanity had simply continued doing what humans always did. Working, building, solving problems, expanding quietly behind the gray patch while the rest of the galaxy maintained its careful, deliberate ignorance. Arlen stood up slowly from the console and walked toward the observation window at the far side of the archive chamber. The stars outside were cold and distant. He stared at them for a long moment. Then the thought that had been forming since he first opened the map finally arrived fully. If they know the galaxy erased them, he thought quietly, why haven't they come looking for us? He stood with the question for a full minute. 412 systems. 8 centuries. A civilization that had watched its own home territory disappear from every official chart in the galaxy and had apparently responded by continuing to build new trade lanes. Why hadn't they come looking? Arlen turned slowly back toward the console. And that was the exact moment the proximity alarm began to sound. Soft, calm, routine. A signal that under normal circumstances meant nothing more significant than a cargo ship passing through on a standard route. But when Arlen looked at the navigation display, he felt his heart skip once, because the incoming vessel wasn't on any known route. And the signal it was broadcasting came from a place that had not appeared on any galactic map for 800 years. Origin, Sol System. Arlen stared at the screen. Then he whispered the words that suddenly felt very important. Someone finally came to say hello. The proximity alarm wasn't loud. Station K-17 had never been designed for emergencies of any kind. It was a listening post, not a defense platform, and its alarm systems reflected that function. The sound was little more than a soft repeating tone that chimed through the archive chamber every few seconds like a gentle reminder rather than a warning. Under normal circumstances, Arlen would have silenced it and gone back to work. But this ship wasn't on any known route, and it wasn't using a conclave registry code, and it was coming from the direction of the gray patch. Arlen moved back to the navigation console quickly. The incoming signal blinked calmly on the display. A single vessel approaching from the far edge of the system. Velocity moderate. Weapons systems inactive. Communications channel open and broadcasting. He tapped the sensor panel and expanded the long-range scan. The station's aging telescopes rotated slowly in their housings, refocusing on the distant object. A few seconds later, the first image was resolved. Arlen blinked. The ship didn't look like anything in the Conclave fleet registry. Most interstellar vessels followed familiar design principles that had developed over centuries of shared engineering culture. Smooth hulls built for minimal interference with navigation fields. Symmetrical structures that distributed internal systems evenly for stability in transit. Clean external geometry optimized for efficiency over everything else. This ship looked practical. Different sections of the hull were clearly from different eras. Older plating sat alongside newer repairs with no apparent concern for visual consistency. Additional antenna clusters had been bolted along the dorsal spine at irregular intervals wherever the engineering had demanded them. Extra armor reinforced several areas near the engine block in ways that suggested the reinforcement had been added after the ship was built rather than designed in from the beginning. Parts of the vessel had been repaired, not cosmetically, not in ways intended to make the repairs invisible. Functionally, the way a machine gets repaired by people who care about whether it works and not at all about whether it looks like it was always supposed to look that way. Arlen zoomed the image closer. The ship wasn't enormous. About the size of a medium research cruiser. Large enough to carry a small crew comfortably. Small enough to be handled efficiently by that same crew without additional support. The identification signal scrolled across the display one more time. Vessel name, Persistence Registry, Human Exploration Service. Arlen exhaled very slowly. Of course it's called that, he murmured to the empty room. The communication console chimed softly. An incoming message request. He stared at it for half a second. Then he opened the channel. The transmission came through immediately. The voice that filled the archive room was calm and relaxed, carrying the slightly rough, unhurried tone of someone very accustomed to speaking across ship communication systems. Station K-17. This is the exploration vessel Persistence out of the Sol system. The speaker paused briefly. We're approaching on a non-hostile heading and would like permission to dock. Arlen stared at the console for a moment. He hadn't expected that. No demands. No declarations. No announcement of intent or statement of grievance or presentation of credentials from the civilization that had spent 8 centuries being erased from galactic maps. Just a request. The voice continued. We've been detecting your station's archive transmissions for a few days now. Figured someone was still operating the place. Another brief pause. Also, if at all possible, we'd appreciate access to whatever passes for coffee around here. Our supply ran out 3 jumps ago. Arlen stared at the console. Then he realized he probably needed to respond. He cleared his throat. This is Arlen Voss, Cartography Authority. He glanced at the sensor display again, just to confirm that the ship was actually there and he wasn't somehow imagining this. You're requesting docking clearance? Correct. The voice sounded faintly amused. Unless this station has a policy against unexpected visitors. Arlen checked the station's operational protocols. The docking bay systems were functional. The airlocks were operational. There was nothing technically preventing a vessel from docking. But there was one detail that made him pause. Your registry code isn't in the Conclave database, he said slowly. Yeah, that makes sense, the voice replied, in the tone of someone acknowledging a minor scheduling conflict. We've been off your maps for a while. Arlen felt a chill settle gently down his spine. That was one way to describe it. Docking permission granted, he said. The sensors showed the ship adjusting course immediately. The Persistence moved toward the station with steady, controlled thruster bursts. The maneuvering was smooth and confident, the kind of approach that came from a crew that had docked in unfamiliar stations many times before and found the process unremarkable. Within a few minutes, the ship settled gently against the station's external docking clamps. Metal locks engaged with a heavy, definitive mechanical thud. The airlock control panel lit up. Arlen stood there for a moment, looking at it. He had just invited the first human visitor to this region of space in 800 years. Right? He muttered quietly to himself. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and headed for the docking bay. The corridors of Station K-17 felt even quieter than usual as he walked through them. The soft hum of the station's systems followed him through the narrow passageways. The recyclers exhaled. The pipes clicked. The processors whispered through their endless patient work. After a minute, he reached the docking chamber. The airlock door was already cycling. Arlen stood on the far side of the room, watching the pressure indicators stabilize as the two atmospheres equalized across the seal. Then the inner hatch opened. For a moment, nothing happened. Then someone stepped through. Arlen had encountered humans many times before. They were common across the conclave systems, working alongside every other species in the known galaxy. Traders, engineers, mechanics, researchers, pilots. He had met dozens of them during his training years and thought nothing particular of it. But seeing one here, stepping through the airlock of a ship that had come from the erased region of the galaxy, carrying a registry code that didn't exist in any official database, made the moment feel strange in a way that was difficult to articulate. The human looked around the docking bay with calm, unhurried interest. Average height, broad-shouldered, dark hair cut short and practical. A worn jacket over his uniform with one sleeve clearly patched where the fabric had torn at some point and been repaired with thread that didn't quite match the original color. In one hand, he carried a large metal travel mug. Steam rose lazily from the top. He took a sip. Then he looked directly at Arlen. For a moment, the two of them simply studied each other across the docking bay. Then the human raised the mug slightly in greeting. "Hi," he said. His voice was the same one from the comm channel. Calm, friendly, almost casual. "My name's Eli Marsh." He glanced around the docking bay once more, taking in the aging equipment with the mild interest of someone who found old machinery genuinely worth looking at. Then back at Arlen. "We noticed nobody's visited our part of the galaxy in a few centuries." He smiled slightly. "So we figured we'd come check if everything was okay." Arlen opened his mouth. I closed it. Then he asked the only question that came to mind. "You just came to say hello?" Marsh shrugged lightly. Seemed like the polite thing to do. He lifted the mug again and took another sip. "Oh, and if this station has customs paperwork or something, I should probably fill that out. We didn't want to just show up without going through whatever the proper process is." The archive station hummed quietly around them, and for the first time in 800 years, a human stood inside it. They moved through the narrow corridors toward the archive chamber, and Marsh walked with the relaxed, unhurried posture of someone who had spent most of his life passing through places that didn't know what to make of him. He looked around at everything with genuine, uncomplicated interest. The aging conduit covers, the original lighting fixtures, the equipment panels that hadn't been updated in generations. Not suspicious, not cautious, just curious. After a few seconds, he stopped beside one of the wall panels and stood still for a moment, listening. "Atmospheric recycler," he said. "Bearings slightly misaligned." Arlen looked at him. "You can tell that just from the sound? You get used to it." Marsh opened the maintenance hatch without asking, reached inside, made a small adjustment with practiced ease, and closed the panel again. The recycler hummed more smoothly. Arlen stared at it. "What did you just do?" "Fixed it." Marsh started walking again. That sound would have turned into a full bearing failure eventually. Could take another few years, could take a few weeks. Hard to know with equipment this old. Arlen stared at the panel for one more second before hurrying after him. They reached the archive chamber a minute later. Marsh stepped inside and stopped. The holographic star map still floated above the console exactly where Arlen had left it. 412 systems glowing quietly in the projection. The gray overlay of the official chart is still visible around the edges where the old survey data hadn't fully replaced it. Marsh studied the map for several seconds without speaking. Then he nodded slowly. "So you found the file." Arlen looked at him sharply. "You knew about it?" Marsh took another sip from his mug. "Not that specific file. But we've known for a long time that the old listening stations kept records that the core network never had access to. We figured if anyone was going to notice the gray patch, it would be someone working in a place like this." Arlen turned to face him fully. "The galaxy erased 412 star systems from the maps," he said. "Yeah. Your star systems." "Yeah." Arlen watched him. "You don't seem angry." Marsh considered that for a moment, tilting his head slightly. "We thought it was kind of funny at first, actually," he said. Arlen blinked. "Funny." "Yeah." Marsh leaned against the console casually, looking at the projection. Imagine waking up one day and discovering that the rest of the galaxy had quietly decided to pretend your entire civilization didn't exist. All the charts updated. All the routes rerouted. 17 signatures on a document nobody was allowed to explain. He smiled slightly. It's a genuinely strange situation. You didn't try to contact anyone? We thought about it. Marsh took another sip. We sent a few probes toward the border regions to see what the reaction would be. Nothing aggressive. Just signals. Nothing came back. He shrugged lightly. And humanity had other things to work on. Arlen gestured toward the map. 412 systems worth of other things. 412, Marsh confirmed, with the automatic precision of someone correcting a number they care about getting right. We've been busy. He looked at Arlen directly. You know the interesting thing about the gray patch? Arlen shook his head. Marsh pointed at the holographic display. It's still there. Arlen frowned. What do you mean? Marsh stepped closer to the projection and traced a finger along the faint gray overlay that still bordered the recovered star field. You can hide something on a map, he said calmly. Reclassify it, restrict it, bury it under 800 years of silence. But that doesn't make the thing itself disappear. He stepped back. The stars were still there. The people were still there. The ships were still traveling those routes. All of it continued, exactly as it always had, while the rest of the galaxy maintained its very careful ignorance. He turned to look at Arlen. Eventually someone notices the blank space. And when someone notices, that's usually when the conversation starts. Arlen stood there for a moment. Then he sat back down at the console. Updating the map would not be a small event. Every navigation system in the Conclave network relied on the authorities' published charts. Every shipping company, every exploration program, every diplomatic mission plans a route through the outer territories. Entire sectors of galactic travel and commerce would shift overnight once 412 systems reappeared in the Western Arm. He opened the publishing console. The station's database connected to the central network, handshaking across the slow uplink beam. A transmission window appeared. Arlen uploaded the recovered survey file. Then he opened the map editor. The gray patch still covered the Western Arm like an old scar. Carefully, methodically, he began replacing it. One system at a time. Sol, New Haven, Orion Gate. The names emerged from the ancient survey data as it merged with the modern charts, each one appearing where only empty space had existed in the official record for 8 centuries. Trade lanes extended outward between them. Navigation corridors formed and connected. The blank, featureless gray slowly transformed into something alive, something inhabited, something that had been there all along. Marsh watched from across the room without speaking. When the final system appeared, the projection zoomed outward automatically, pulling back to show the full sweep of the spiral arm. And for the first time in 800 years, human space was visible on the map. Not hidden, not restricted, not erased. Just there. Arlen leaned back in his chair and looked at it. The archive system presented one final prompt. Publish updated chart to Conclave Network? He hesitated for only a moment. Then he pressed confirm. The transmission beam activated with a low hum that he could feel faintly through the console. Across thousands of star systems, navigation databases began receiving the updated chart simultaneously. Ships in deep space would see the change first, their instruments suddenly showing hundreds of new systems glowing in a region that had shown nothing for as long as anyone currently alive had been navigating those routes. Captains would glance at their displays and stop. Explorers would begin making plans. Historians would start pulling records and asking questions that had no existing answers. The gray patch would vanish everywhere at once, like a word being returned to a sentence that had been quietly missing it for centuries. Marsh stepped closer to the projection. He stood in front of it for a long time, looking at it without speaking. The map rotated slowly in the air before him, 412 suns burning in steady, patient light. Then he reached out and touched one star near the center of the field. The label appeared beside it. Sol. Marsh stood there with his hand just below the label. The travel mug came down to his side. For the first time since stepping off the Persistence, he didn't look casual. He looked like someone looking at home. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. Looks better, he said. Quietly. More quietly than anything he had said before. Arlen watched him. You don't seem surprised that it worked. Marsh smiled faintly. Not really. He looked at the map for another moment. Humans are patient. Arlen turned back to the projection. 412 systems shining clearly where empty space had been yesterday. Why did you really come? He asked. Marsh considered the question. He didn't answer immediately, which felt different from the easy, immediate responses he had given to everything else. Because the gray patch was still there, he said finally, which meant nobody had noticed yet. And we knew, eventually, someone would. Someone working in a forgotten station on the edge of the Karthus system who liked looking for interesting mistakes. He looked at Arlen. We just wanted to be nearby when it happened. He lifted the mug again. We also genuinely needed the coffee. Arlen was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing that had been sitting at the edge of his thoughts since he had first opened the ancient file. I read the first contact report, the one written by the survey team that visited Earth. Marsh raised an eyebrow. They described humanity as psychologically contradictory, Arlen said. Violent and restrained at the same time. Resilient beyond what their models expected. They said your behavior was extremely difficult to predict. Marsh nodded slowly. Sounds about right. The Breath Admiral said the same thing. In different words, on day 96 of a campaign he had expected to finish in 3. Marsh smiled, but didn't say anything. The Solon economist said it, Arlen continued. The surveyor who watched your ships from across the border said it. Every fragment in that archive pointed at the same thing. He paused. Nobody could figure out what to do with a civilization that simply wouldn't stop. Marsh was quiet for a moment. So they decided to pretend we weren't there, he said. Yes. Marsh nodded again, unsurprised. He looked at the star map one more time. Then he turned toward the observation window. You know what the strangest part is? He said. Arlen waited. We understood it. Marsh looked out at the stars. Not at first, but eventually. When you can't predict something, when every model you build fails, and every strategy you try produces the opposite of what you intended, the easiest response is to stop engaging. Draw a line. Call the space beyond it uncharted. He was quiet for a moment. We didn't take it personally. We just kept working. He turned back from the window. That's the thing nobody outside ever quite seemed to understand about humans. We're not driven by what other people think of us. We're driven by the work itself, by the problem sitting in front of us, by the question that doesn't have an answer yet. He picked up the mug again. The galaxy decided to pretend we weren't there. So we built 412 systems worth of reasons for them to eventually change their minds. Arlen looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back at the map. And now, he asked. Marsh took a final sip from the travel mug and looked out through the observation window at the stars of the western arm burning quietly in the darkness. Now, he said calmly, the galaxy finally knows where to find us. Outside the station window, 412 suns continued their slow, patient burn through the darkness. No longer hidden, just waiting, the way they had always been, the way they would always be. And somewhere across thousands of star systems, in the navigation displays of ships that had been traveling the same rerouted lanes for 8 centuries, a map was quietly changing. Stars were appearing where blank space had been. Names were returning to places that had never stopped existing. Routes were forming between worlds that had never stopped being inhabited. The gray patch was gone, and in its place, patient and bright and entirely unsurprised to be found, an entire civilization was reappearing in the light. One star at a time. The way interesting things always do. Not with an announcement. Not with fanfare. Just quietly. Stubbornly. There.